Well, hello, Nativity Bible heads. It is Dr. Wayne, and I am back again at it in this new year, 2021, with Bible Study Wednesday. The last 5 weeks, the ones in December, we were doing a special walkthrough for Advent Christmastide of the Gospel of Mark, which is the Gospel for year B, which began in November and continues throughout 2021 until the new calendar begins at the end of November. We are back today with our walkthrough of the Bible that we were doing when we started. I cannot remember exactly when we started this walkthrough of the entire Bible. It's got to have been, this might be our third year we're going through it. We started with Genesis. We're in 1 Kings now, and 1 Kings is the, you can think of it as like the beginning of the end of the narrative that we have in the Tanakh, which is the way the Jewish people describe the Old Testament. Last we were together in this trek, we were in 1 Kings chapter 3. Tonight, we are in chapters 4 and 5, okay? So we are in the middle of, or in the midst of, King Solomon's reign. And King Solomon, in our last lesson in chapter 3, we got an example of, you see, he was like given a choice. Like, well, it's like, if you think of it as a wish from a genie, you know how those genies you'd find this lamp and you'd rub it and a genie would come out and they'd say, okay, you get 3 wishes. Well, King Solomon didn't find a lamp, but he did have that kind of a moment with God, if you will. And what he asked for was wisdom. And we are told he got it. And we were given an example of his wisdom with the prostitute, and I don't know if it's 2 prostitutes, but anyway, 2 women, and the decision about a baby, and his decision to that rendered the woman who was truly the mom with the child. In chapter 4 and 5, what we're doing is we are building up to the construction, if you will, of the temple. Now, we've got to always keep the long view in mind. What's the long view? The long view is, as readers, we are supposed to, the writer / narrator presumes that we know how all of this is going to go. We're not an ignorant reader. That's not a bad thing. That just means we're uninformed. We are a knowledgeable reader. We are what some would call not the perfect reader, the implied reader. When I was in seminary, I really enjoyed my classes in narrative criticism, literary criticism, and it allowed me to take the Bible to a level of and understanding it as a narrative plot and how the narrative proceeds. Every narrative has a reader in mind. There's the implied reader. That's the reader that it's implied. It's like, okay, it's as though their narrator knows where we are. And so the narrator is giving us information that even though we know how things are going to turn out in the end, we're given this now to think like, yeah, and you know how it all turned out. That's kind of what 1 Kings 4 and 5 is like. We are working up to the building of the temple again. Now, Solomon's reign. Now, I know, even though all of y'all might not be aware of this, but we've got to keep something at the forefront of our brains when we are reading through this, and that is this. Solomon's reign will not end in glory. Solomon's reign will end in the kingdom dividing along northern and southern divisions. So even though we see wisdom, examples of wisdom of Solomon, in the end, we're not so sure he was that good of an administrator. We're not sure he was that good of a king. The fact that he was given wisdom and it was all by God's grace, well, wisdom, just because we are smart in certain things doesn't mean that necessarily translates to everything that we're about and we do. In the end, it appears that Solomon was lacking in a lot of ability, shall we say. All right, got to keep that in mind because we are going to be wowed by what the narrator is telling us. Okay, so chapter 4. King Solomon, so we're in 1 Kings chapter 4. King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his high officials. Azariah, son of Zadok, was the priest. Elihoreph and Ahijah, sons of Shisha, were secretaries. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was in command of the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Azariah, son of Nathan, was over the officials. Zabud, son of Nathan, was priest and king's friend. Ahishar was in charge of the palace, and Adoniram, son of Abda, was in charge of the forced labor. What? The forced labor? Yeah, the forced labor. We are told that there was a department in King Solomon's reign where it's another word for slavery. Now, slavery back then was not necessarily determined by your race or your skin color, the way we think of slavery in the United States with our history of what we did. It's more along the lines accurately described as people who couldn't pay their debts, who it's like you end up paying your debts how? Through working it off. Forced labor, okay? This list in verses 1 through 6 is one list. Remember, our biblical editors, if you will, redactors, did not always weed out things that were repetitive. Frequently, what we got was, there's this list, and then there's this list. Maybe there's overlap, maybe there's not. Maybe it's two different sources talking about the same thing. Our redactors were keen on, we're not throwing anything away. We're putting it all in there. So look, verses 7 and following seem to cover something similar to what we just saw, but I don't know, maybe it's different. You'll see some names similar, but verses 7 and following in 1 Kings chapter 4. Solomon had 12 officials over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each one had to make provision for 1 month in the year. These were their names. Ben-Hur, interesting name, right? In the hill country of Ephraim. Ben-Decker in Makaz. Shealabim, Beth-Shemesh, and Elon Beth-Hahan. Ben-Hesed in Aruboth. To him belongs Soko and all the land of Hepher. Ben-Abinadab and all Naphath-dor. He had Tapath, Solomon's daughter, as his wife. Oh, little son-in-law, little nepotism going on. Verse 12. Be'anah, son of Ahilud, in Te'anach. Megiddo and all Beth-Shean, which is beside Zarethan, below Jezreel. And from Beth-Shin to Abel-Meholah, as far as the other side of Jokmeam. Ben-Geber in Ramoth Gilead. He had the village of Jair, son of Manasseh, which are in Gilead. And he had the region of Argob, which is in Bashan. 60 great cities with walls and bronze bars. Ahinadab, son of Edo, in Mahanaim. Ahimaaz in Naphtali. He had taken Basemath, Solomon's daughter, as his wife. So another son-in-law. Nepotism. Verse 16. Baana, son of Hushai, in Asher and Baaloth. Jehoshaphat, son of Paruah, in Issachar. Shimei, son of Elah, in Benjamin. Gebar, son of Uri, in the land of Gilead, the country of King Sihon, of the Amorites, and of King Og of Bashan. And there was one official in the land of Judah. All right, so what's this all about? So Solomon trying to replicate the 12 tribal divisions of the land, divided up into 12 administrative regions. This is an example of what he did. And as we see, there was some nepotism involved. The idea, okay, our narrator is trying to convey the idea that wisdom, or that Solomon, you know, he had a lot going on, did a lot, worked a lot, seemed like he delegated a lot. It's building up to something. Let's just keep continuing and just see where this is all going. Verse 20. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. Now, what does that remind you? It should remind us of one of the promises that Abraham was made, that his descendants would be as numerous as what? Yeah, the sand by the sea. They ate and drank. We're in the middle of verse 20 of 1 Kings chapter 4. They ate and drank and were happy. We are being given a picture of everybody being satisfied. But remember, as the implied reader who knows how everything ends up, it doesn't end well. It doesn't end well at all. So therefore, this feeling of prosperity, of being, you know, happy and all that, it's kind of an illusion if you think about it. Let's continue. Verse 21. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. This is a little bit of a hyperbole, a little bit of an exaggeration. Verse 22 and following is going to give us an idea of the opulent lifestyle of Solomon and his court. Verse 22. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal. Now, before we continue, I have a footnote here that's going to tell us what a core is. A core is like 61 bushels is what I thought I had read earlier. My eyes are not falling on it right now, but I believe I saw that earlier, that it was like a core is like 61. It's a lot, okay? It's a lot. It's an extravagant lot, okay? And so when it talks about Solomon's provisions, it's not just, doesn't mean him. It means his entire palace, okay? Verse 23, 10 fat oxen a day? Yeah, this is a day. And 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. Verse 24. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tifsha to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, all of them under their vines and fig trees. This is kind of a picture of like, yeah, everybody was modestly wealthy. There was no such thing as low class or middle class. Everybody was living good. This is not an uncommon thing to find promised by politicians even in our day and age. The idea that, oh yes, well, the problem is the middle class can't get their jobs, and how do you get elected? You promise to make everybody prosperous. When we know in reality that that's not the way that works in reality, from what we've seen anyway. Verse 26. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Because you got to have at least 3 horses for every horseman. Why? Because a horseman can ride a horse a lot longer than a horse can be ridden. So yeah, you're going to have at least 3 times as many horses. Those officials supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Verse 28. They also brought to the required place barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds, each according to his charge. The narrator is trying to give us, paint us a picture of opulence, of like overwhelming abundance. And we're supposed to be awed by it, like, oh, wow, that is something. But spoiler alert, it doesn't bode well in the end. Verse 29. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding, as vast as the sand on the seashore. So it's as though his wisdom was as vast as the number of the people. Verse 30. So that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, wiser than Ethan, the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, children of Mahol. His fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. Very opulent picture, right? Not only was he living high on the hog, he was also known very well. It's like everybody's like, yeah, there's nobody wiser than Solomon. 32, verse 32, 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. So this one verse right here, this one verse is that to which we can attribute the fact that that wisdom writings and the Song of Solomon, what we call the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament, is attributed to the writing of Solomon. It's a tradition. It's not necessarily reality, but that is how he came to be thought of as the author of all of that. He composed 3,000. If you're going to compose 3,000 proverbs, how could you not be the writer of the book of Proverbs in the Bible? This is kind of the way they were thinking. And the song that we call the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, same thing. He probably didn't write them, but that's not a big deal. Verse 33. He would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in the Lebanon to the hyssop that grows in the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. So apparently his wisdom apparently he had more than just wisdom. He had some what we call brain smarts. Apparently, though, not everything that was needed, because he is going to fail. We must keep this in mind as the implied reader of this narrative. Verse 34, people came from all nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So he drew a large crowd. People couldn't stay away. They had to okay, we got to go listen to this guy. All right. Now, that's the picture that we are being painted. We're supposed to be awed. We're supposed to be like, wow, this is, and at the same time we're thinking, but then it's all going to go downhill. How? So a lot of times in narratives, what we get is we get a buildup. We get a buildup because we know that it can't stay the way it is. That's what we're listening to. That's what we're hearing in this buildup. It's like, it's kind of like making things sound like they're really good, but can it really be that good? Well, that's the way we're supposed to be thinking as the reader. All right, chapter 5. And then we'll conclude. Chapter 5 is only like 18 verses. Okay, 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Now, Hiram of Tyre sent his servants to Solomon, whom he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram had always been a friend to David. Now, Remember who Hiram was. Tyre, remember where Tyre was? Tyre was on the coast, a little farther north, not in the orbit of Israel, non-Israelite, okay, non-Hebrew. Hiram becomes a very valuable resource because he had access to hard resources, tangible resources that Solomon was going to need to build things, specifically the temple, okay? Verse 2, Solomon sent word to Hiram saying, verse 3, you know that my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord, his God, because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. Remember that whole thing about David wanted to build a temple, but God said, no, I tell you what, I'll make you a name. I'll make you a house. You want to build me a house? I'll build you a house. That's what God did to David. But Solomon, not the same thing. He was seen as a king who had clean hands. Therefore, he was more worthy to build a temple to the Lord, which is what we're going to get later. But here, verse 6, 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 6. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. A very Pax Israeli, right? So I intend to build a house for the Lord, as the Lord said to my father David, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name. So therefore, Solomon, as far as he was concerned, this is on that checklist of things that God had him doing. Verse 6, therefore, command that cedars from, now who's talking here? Solomon is talking. Therefore, command the cedars from the Lebanon, that's the area that would become the country of Lebanon. Lebanon used to be highly Christian, but it was renowned for what? Timber, the cedars. If you want cedar wood, you got to go to Lebanon and get it. Therefore, command that cedars from Lebanon be cut for me. My servants will join your servants, and I will give you whatever wages you set for your servants. For you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. The Sidonians, Tyre and Sidon were cities, nation states, if you will, on the coast. Hiram was of Tyre. The Sidonians is a nearby town. If you wanted access to that wood to build things with, you had to make friends with the people up there, like Hiram, yada, yada. Verse 7, when Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, finally, I got an outlet for all this wood. No, not really. Here he is. Blessed be, this is what he said, 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 7, second half of the verse, and said, blessed be the Lord today, who has given to David a wise son to be over this great people. Remember, Hiram was an ally of David's, even though he never was in the orbit of David's. He kind of paid tribute, but we have a picture painted that they were still friendly, him with Solomon. Verse 8, Hiram sent word to Solomon. I have heard the message that you have sent to me. I will fulfill all your needs in the matter of cedar and cypress timber. My servants, verse 9, my servants shall bring it down to the sea from the Lebanon. Why is it called the Lebanon? Because that wasn't actually the name of a country or a city. It was like an area, if you will. The Lebanon, kind of like the way we used to think of the Russian state Ukraine. We used to call it the Ukraine. Why did we call it that? Because we thought of it not as necessarily a nation, but as an area. So this is the Lebanon, okay? I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place you indicate. You get that picture? Floating the logs down. How did they move logs? They didn't put wheels under them or put them on trucks or flatbed trucks. They floated them down the water. I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place you indicate. I will have them broken up there for you to take away. So they would float the big logs. They wouldn't process it until they got it to the port, and that's where they would have a processing plant, and that's when it would be broken up into lumber, okay? And you shall meet my needs by providing food for my household. Okay, good deal. So that's the deal that Solomon had with Hiram. Verse 10, so Hiram supplied Solomon's every need for timber of cedar and cypress. We haven't been told yet, but that's what he's going to use this for, the building of the temple in chapters 6 and 7. Solomon in turn, verse 11, 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 11. Solomon in turn gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household and 20 cores of fine oil. And again, didn't I not refer to that earlier? Like a core, 61, oh, here we go. As a liquid measure, it was about 61 gallons if you're talking liquids. If you're talking dry measure, 6.5 bushels. Okay, so either way, it's like 230 liters of things, okay? Okay, that's what we're talking about. It's a lot of stuff. Verse 12. So the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, as he promised him. There was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. This is something that ends up to be, Solomon will be condemned for eventually, but this is how he managed to gain the resources, because they didn't have the kind of wood to build the kind of temple that they ended up building, that he wanted to build. They didn't have that kind of wood in Israel, so they had to get it from somewhere, okay? Verses 13 and following in 1 Kings chapter 5. King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel. Not something that he's applauded for in the end. The levy numbered 30,000 men. He sent them to the Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in the Lebanon and 2 months at home. So we got a picture of like how long they would work and then the leave time they would get. Adoniram, the second half or the last sentence of verse 14, Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. We were introduced to Adoniram, were we not? Back in chapter 4, verse 6. The forced labor ends up being a real bugger for Solomon. Verse 15. Solomon also had 70,000, can you believe this word? 70,000 laborers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country. All of these numbers are greatly exaggerated. I do not think that it behooves us to take them literally. Verse 16, besides Solomon's 3,300 supervisors who were over the work, having charge of the people who did the work. That's a lot of supervisors as well. 3,300 supervisors. Okay, verse 17. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. Do you remember in the New Testament Gospels when Jesus is leaving the temple with his disciples, and they say, "Ooh, what great stones!" Well, that wasn't the same temple, but this is where you get the idea that if you're gonna build a temple, you gotta have these. You gotta quarry out something really huge. Yeah, so remember this. The temple that Jesus saw is not the temple here that's being built. Okay. Verse 18, last verse, and then we're done. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Gebalites did the stone cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. So we're all set up for the building of the temple. And Solomon's wisdom at this point does not seem, we haven't been given an example of like, oh, this was a good choice, this was a good choice. We only have that one example of the women and the baby. In all of this, in all of this description, we're supposed to be impressed with the opulence of it all, but yet we're supposed to keep in mind, we know it's not going to turn out well. When Solomon's kingship is over, the kingdom is going to divide into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So there's something drastically, tragically wrong that he does. It's important that we keep that in mind, because as the biblical narrative proceeds into the New Testament, what we find is that, especially in the Christian documents, in the Christian Gospels and such, the book of Acts as well, the building of the temple is not considered necessarily it's like, yeah, it gets, the second temple gets destroyed in 70 AD, never has yet been rebuilt, not rebuilt to this day. And in the New Testament, a lot of times reference to the temple is like, yeah, that was great, but you know what? We don't have to yearn for that anymore. So we got to keep this in mind. And as we process through Solomon's reign, we're going to see how this use of his discernment, his wisdom, how it all plays out. That is it for our lesson today. We've got to remember one of the things we want to keep in mind is that our wisdom, the wisdom that we have, it doesn't necessarily translate to like, does that mean every single decision we make is like perfect? It is possible that God can grace us with something, with a gift that doesn't necessarily mean our life is perfect, but yet our exercise of a certain gift might bless people, it might educate people, it might keep people inspired. That doesn't mean everything is well, necessarily. That doesn't mean that that person, like everything they touch, not like King Midas, everything they touch turns to gold. Any gift that any one person exercises as a gift from God for the good of other people, it doesn't mean that everything is okay. It just means that God has somehow infiltrated a segment of that person's psyche that allows them to minister, to make good decisions. It doesn't mean that everything's fine. It doesn't mean everything's good. This is something we've got to keep in mind, because we, as humans, we tend to elevate or exaggeratedly, look highly upon some people who we might admire, like, oh, they got great wisdom. And that doesn't mean they've got everything together. This is important because we tend to idolize some people to the point that we devalue ourselves and we fail and we start to just put ourselves down, as opposed to find what it is inside ourselves that need to find expression for what God wants to express and how we can necessarily minister. This is what we want to keep in mind when we talk about Solomon, all right? Yes, good King Solomon. So next week we'll be in chapter 6. I don't know if we'll get to chapter 7 or not. Maybe we will, but that's where we'll be. Oh, and going forward, we're not going to do, I used to close with the prayers of Compline. We're not going to close with the prayers of Compline. I want to save that for when we can return and do it in person. I had been doing it up to December, but I had a realization. It's like, you know what? We need to save that for when we can do it again in person. I think it'll be more meaningful, more of a blessing for us all. So that is how we will proceed. And blessings on your week. And we'll see you, as I've often said, in church.